All right, there we go. Well, like I said, I'm Jacob. Uh, it's really good to meet you, and thank you for taking the time out of, I'm sure, a very busy schedule to do this interview. It should only last about between 40 to 50 minutes, maybe an hour. So I'll go ahead and just jump right in. Um, Maybe a little bit of cliche as an initial question, but it's always something I'm genuinely interested in is how did you initially become interested in music theory as a field, or really what was your journey kind of to getting to where you are now as a music theorist?
Well, I thought you would probably ask a question like that. Um, I didn't have a sudden moment when I knew I wanted to be a professional music theorist and become a professor of music theory. When I was an undergraduate student at the University of North Texas, you can probably tell by my accent that I'm a Texan. I'm just kidding. I moved to Texas when I was a teenager, from England to Texas, and went to a North Dallas high school, Richardson, Texas, and from there went to the University of North Texas for my undergraduate. And when I was there, I was more interested in being a composer and being a performer. I had a couple of professors when I was an undergraduate at North Texas who really inspired me, music theory professors. One of those was Kevin Corson, who now teaches at the University of Michigan, and another of those was the late Professor Gene Cho. And when I went on to do my master's degree at North Texas, and I was quickly given the assignment of teaching music theory fundamentals class, and I just loved it. I loved being able to share my insights. And I think from the very outset, I was drawing upon examples from popular music that I grew up playing. I mean, I guess I should backtrack a bit. I'm a I have a sort of side career that I'm managing to keep going as a professional keyboardist and vocalist. And I've played in a number of different bands over the years, in England, in Texas, now up here in the Northeast, the US. Um, so I would always find ways to bring in examples from pop and rock into my classes as well as classical. So I've kind of think about music in I've never really separated the two in my head, to be honest. Um, but then I had another professor who came to North Texas a little later. I took a couple of years off. After I finished my master's degree, I took a teaching gig in Singapore, of all places. And I was teaching at a small college of the arts called LaSalle College of the Arts. This was in the early 90s. I came back from there after 2 years and came back to Texas, and I started my doctoral studies at the University of North Texas. And I had a professor there whose name you probably recognize. This was about, oh, 32 years ago now, John Kovach. And he said to me, Mark, you should go to a place like Yale to study music theory. You should not stay here. You've been here for 2 degrees. You should go to Yale, or someplace like Yale. And so I thought, that's right. I was playing in a band in Texas that was pretty successful at the time. But I thought, well, thinking of my career 20, 30 years down the road, right? I think this is probably a good move to go and pursue a doctoral degree at a fine institution like Yale. And so that's what I did. And I immediately started taking classes with Alan Fort, I think just at the right time, because of course Alan Fort he has a kind of mixed reputation. Um, Yale was known as a kind of bastion of traditional 20th century music theory, Schenker and Setz, right? But I was the kind of renegade who was interested in rock music, and Alan supported that, right? He became my dissertation advisor. I think it's because he was working on one of his last books on the American popular ballad of the golden era. And this was popular music that he admired when he was a youngster, you know, like Cole Porter, Jerome Kern, George Gershwin, that kind of stuff. And he confided in me that he felt that he could have taken that music seriously and written about it as a music theorist earlier in his career, but he didn't feel that the academy was ready yet at the time. So he waited really until the end or toward the end of his career to start publishing about that repertoire. And so when I announced to him that I wanted to write in my dissertation about British pop and rock music in the post-Beatles era, he was very supportive of that. And I became the first one at Yale to write my dissertation on pop and rock repertoire. And that was some 25 or so years ago. I felt like kind of the odd man out then because it was just starting to take a foothold at SMT. We started this popular music interest group at SMT in 1998, right? And for a few years after that first meeting of the interest group, we would hold a special session at SMT every year proposed by the popular music interest group. And we felt, okay, proposing it as a special session was a way to get analysis of popular music onto the program, right? Well, now it's entirely redundant I think, to have that popular music interest group. There's plenty of younger scholars who are doing interesting and excellent work in the analysis of popular music, so much so that a couple of years ago, I was the chair of the program committee for the big mega conference in New Orleans as we were coming out of the COVID pandemic. And we probably had, oh, I don't know, the usual 300, 350 proposals submitted. And I would say that fully 1/3 of those proposals were on popular music topics.
Wow.
So we were able to easily put together several sessions devoted to popular music, and not all of those papers got onto the program, and it's really quite remarkable how far at least that sub-discipline of the field has come in 25 years.
It offers a lot for someone like me that's kind of just now getting into the field, a lot of opportunities to explore and kind of grow along with that as well. I want to jump back a little bit to when you said you were doing some teaching right at the beginning there over at North Texas. And I'm actually also from Texas. I grew up in the DFW area, so I know exactly where Richardson is, all of that
Cool.
stuff. Um, so when you were starting to bring in more of the popular music into your studies, I know it was kind of part of your background as a musician. Did it also occur to you that it might be relatable to the students in some way as well? Or was it really just that was kind of where you were comfortable and you wanted to use that in the classroom?
Oh, it was really both. I mean, I know that it was relatable to the students because, I mean, when I first started teaching, I was in my early to mid 20s. And so I wasn't really much older than the undergraduates I was teaching. So I was keeping abreast of what was on the charts. And also, I mean, I was a big aficionado of really, you know, recorded pop of the last 20 or 30 years at the time. So kind of going back to the 60s, I'm talking about now late 80s, early 90s when I started teaching. But yes, I found that it was certainly a way to relate to the students. But at North Texas in particular, there was a lot of jazz students. They have an outstanding jazz studies program. I kind of fake it when it comes to jazz. I think I can play jazz fairly well, but I was never part of that jazz scene at North Texas. I never auditioned for any of the jazz lab bands or anything like that. Like I said, as an undergraduate student, I was a composition major. So I was writing electronic pieces and working with this with synclavier and other kinds of synthesizers and all of this. So I was very, I suppose, as a practitioner of music, I was keeping abreast in music technology in terms of using synthesizers. I remember very well when that transition from analog to digital happened in the 80s, and I bought a Yamaha DX7 synthesizer the first year it came out, which was like 1983, I believe. I had one. I
That
was
was
eight,
probably pricey at that point as well.
about $2,000 at the time, which was quite a lot of money for an 18-year-old freshman in college at the time. But I actually I played some other instruments when I was in high school, some traditional instruments, like I played the oboe. I took oboe lessons and I played percussion as well as playing piano and all of this. So I still had my oboe and I sold my oboe to buy a Roland Jupiter 4. I did that and then I had some other, so I started collecting keyboards when I was an undergraduate so that I was playing gigs in the evening and going to school during the day. And I'm kind
I
of still doing that.
that is quite amazing. My wife is actually an oboe player, so I think she would love to hear that you sold one to buy a synthesizer because that's
Yeah,
something
I
I
knew
would
that I wasn't going to go very far as an oboist because I was pretty good in high school, but I could never sustain that embouchure, the and play the oboe for uh, I didn't think that was my calling professionally, that instrument. So I got rid of it to buy a keyboard, electric keyboard. A
I
Roland
kind of
Jupiler 4 is a great thing to have. I was inspired by Duran Duran to get one of those
oh
and
yeah,
Human League because the Roland Jupiter 4 has that wonderful feature on it called the arpeggiator. So
yes.
you can create these blippy arpeggiations like you hear all over the Duran Duran Rio album, for example.
I've recently gotten into a little bit of the modular synth world as well. I got a small Korg micro modular synth, and I've been, not to get on too much of a tangent, but that is another interest of mine for sure. And I actually, in my undergrad, I was a jazz drum set major, so that's we also have that kind of jazz background. You being at UNT, although not necessarily in the jazz department. I wanted to kind of circle back to when you landed on pop music as a subject for your dissertation. I know you said that Alan Fort was very supportive of that, but did you find that there were others maybe that were not as supportive, or just in general, did it feel like you were maybe a little bit of an outsider when you were initially trying to begin publishing, uh, specifically with pop music?
A bit, yes. Um, when I started work on my dissertation, pop music was just a part of it. I was writing a larger study about musical influence and intertextuality, and I had three big case studies. One was on Mozart, one was on Liszt, and one was on the Beatles. And I realized I had taken on or I'd bitten off more than I could chew because I felt like I was working on three dissertations at once. I mean, it shared the common thread of musical influence and intertextuality, but the way in which that worked in the music of Mozart in the late 18th century and in the 19th century with Liszt, and then with recorded popular music with the Beatles, it was very different. And so I was then doing more and more work. I gave a talk in 1996 when I was a student at Yale, when I was a doctoral student. There was a big conference at the Eastman School of Music, which was called um, Crossover Relations popular music and the canon. And this is when people in the academy were first starting to talk about um, popular music entering the repertoire of music to teach, right? The canon, I suppose, or questioning what the canon really is and whether it's even viable anymore in the way we teach 20th century music. These are questions that were being asked in the late 20th century. And so Alan Fort was very supportive when I told him I just want to write my whole dissertation about this. But it took my getting an outside reader who was not on the Yale faculty, who was already a published expert in popular music theory, if you will, and that was Walter Everett, to come on board as one of my readers of my dissertation. And he and I struck up a friendship, which we share to this day. But he was also had begun to put together an essay collection of essays that some of the chapters in that collection were taken from papers that were delivered at that crossover relations conference at Eastman. And I had given a talk on the music of Genesis, the band Genesis, not the biblical
Yes.
book, the band Genesis. And that, as I was working on that, it was a sort of a deep and close analysis of a 23-minute epic track from an early Genesis album called Foxtrot from the early 1970s. The song is called Supper's Ready. And Peter Gabriel was the lead singer of Genesis at the time. Phil Collins was the drummer. But I just adored that record, that album, and I had spent many, many, many hours listening to that track over and over and over again since I was a teenager. And so it just kind of felt natural to sort of dive into that as a scholar and to analyze it and to talk about what I felt made the music work. But a lot of what I found myself writing about as I analyzed that piece was how it referenced other styles, how it cannot really be treated as an autonomous piece of music. You have to consider it in relation to a whole kind of intertextual network of other tracks and other pieces. Um, and that's really been a thread running through my work ever since. One of the threads is
Do
this
you,
idea of
sorry,
intertext. Yeah,
it's kind of speaking along those lines. One of the things that popped out when I was reading the Fragile, Emergent, and Absent Tonics article was you mentioned the idea of musical worlding. I think just a couple times, which I think is from John Kovac, if I'm
that's
correct
right.
in that. It, how did you come across uh, implementing those sorts of ideas into your writing?
I think, well, it's not like I set about to do it. I think whenever I approach a new analysis or a new piece of scholarly writing, I mean, when we're in graduate school and we're taking seminars and writing papers and this kind of thing, we we're learning different kinds of analytical techniques. Some of these we might learn, but we may never actually implement them in our own scholarly work later. Others we will use. And so I found that idea of musical worlding in John's formulation. I found that very intriguing. I also started reading largely inspired by Kevin Corson, the work of Harold Bloom. And there was an article of Kevin's from the early 90s called Towards a New Poetics of Musical Influence, which was published in Musical Analysis in 1991. And he's analyzing works by Chopin, by Brahms, this kind of thing. But I took a lot of those ideas and decided that they could profitably be applied to pop music as well, particularly in terms of speaking about the ubiquitousness of the Beatles' influence, really, right? How the Beatles were kind of head and shoulders. They cast this huge shadow over subsequent um, generations of pop and rock musicians, that in order to forge their own originality, these subsequent generations of musicians had to kind of struggle with or grapple with the Beatles' influence. Um, that might sound very pompous, but I think it does make sense for certainly for certain bands or artists whose music that I've studied.
And it definitely came across in the Tears for Fears article that you sent me as well. I
Yeah,
had
that's
never
a really thing.
considered that fully, and reading through it, it was very intriguing. And I'm wondering, with that being published, I guess, in a collection of works all revolving around Beatles and humor, did you approach writing it differently, or was it a project you already had and it ended up fitting quite well with this collection that was being put together?
I had this piece that I had given as a talk about 6 years ago for a conference that was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Sgt. Pepper album. It was organized by Walter Everett and some other folks. And so I gave a talk specifically about that one Tears for Fears track that is spotlighted in that chapter, and that's a song called Sowing the Seeds of Love, which was released in 1989. And it sounds like it could have been recorded in, aside from some of the digital effects and stuff, it easily sounds like it could have been recorded in 1967. And the more I started listening to it, it wasn't just a kind of surface imitation of the Beatles. It was very cleverly and strategically referencing multiple Beatles songs all at once, all from 1967, to sort of make it a hyper reference to the 1967 Summer of Love at a time when people were talking about in the late 80s a kind of new summer of love in the UK. This was when rave culture was really big, and a lot of young folks were very dissatisfied with Margaret Thatcher's politics and stuff like that. And they were turning to music. A similar kind of political unrest and dissatisfaction with the establishment than was going on in the late 60s, was going on in the late 80s. So it seemed to be a good mix. And then the more I started to explore the rest of Tears for Fears work, I realized that you could cast the entire trajectory of their work in terms of the fact, well, when they started out, they sounded nothing like the Beatles at all, right? They were dealing, in fact, they almost, you could say that they were kind of rejecting or trying to sound, and I think this the same could be said of a lot of groups in the early 80s. It was no longer cool to love the Beatles for a little while there in the synth pop and new wave era, right? Um, so then why would Tears for Fears change their mind in the late 80s and then go on to do more of that later on, like in the early 2000s after a long hiatus? So I found that it was a really interesting story to tell about Tears for Fears and their style. And a lot of my hunches came true, actually, because they went on another big long hiatus, and then all of a sudden they came out with another new record in 2022 called The Tipping Point, which, as I was finishing up my work on that chapter, I thought, oh no, here we go again. Here's another new release. I've got to take into account this new album and see if it fits my idea about their overall relationship to the Beatles and their influence. And sure enough, I think it did. And I hear Tears for Fears now they're I mean, I went to see them on tour last year and they were fantastic. And they're working on another album too. So they're still going strong. They're both in their 60s and they're making new music. God bless them, you know. This is
Yeah,
after taking like 20 years off, almost 18 years off. And then
that is
getting,
quite. Yeah, I didn't know they were working on even more new music.
you know,
That's very impressive that they're still going at it like that. That's awesome. Um, I do want to maybe ask a couple more questions regarding the fragile emergent absent tonics article, which was kind of the impetus for reaching out to you for this interview in the first place. It was part of Dr. Osborn's seminar that we read and presented on in class. So I one of my questions that I was thinking when reading is for you personally, when you're listening to a song and determining a tonic, for you, what's the primary reason to actually end up saying, okay, this is a song that has a C chord and a D chord, but C is the tonic, just for an example? What's your primary motivation, I guess, for identifying a tonic to begin with?
well, that is the question, isn't it? Um, this idea of the idea of fragile, emergent, and absent tonics was this is one of these things that sometimes it takes a while for an idea to formulate and to gestate. Um, I had given that paper for the first time in 2009, and it was simply called Absent Tonics in Pop and Rock Songs. And what I was trying to get at there were these situations where you've got this kind of looping progression. Sometimes it can be a shuttle back and forth between just two chords, or it can be a three-chord loop or something like that, where everything else in the song, particularly the melody, right, seems to be gravitating around or emphasizing a particular note. Like if you were listening to just the melody alone, and if you had to stop and hum the note that you thought was the tonic, right? That might be it. But then the harmonies underneath aren't really supporting that idea. It might, now this is getting related to this idea of what's sometimes called a melodic harmonic divorce, but it doesn't always happen that way, because oftentimes in a song where you say there's an absent tonic, right, the the notes in the melody are fitting with the chords below, right? It just doesn't seem to make sense to make it or insist that it's part of a conventional kind of key signature, right? So I'm sitting at the piano now. So the classic example for that would be, well, the song that I begin the article with is Daryl Hall and John Oates's song called She's Gone, which begins with a shuttle, right? Something like that. Then something like that, right? So I played some wrong notes in there. I'll just play it again. Well, none of the chords we've heard there to me are really the tonic at all, right? It's kind of promising that, but we haven't heard it yet, right? And then finally, when we get to the chorus, it's just a repeating progression. So that's four, the tonic in first inversion, two, back to the five, but then it slips back to this or just stays on that chord. It never finds the root position tonic that it seems to always be searching for. I had always heard the song that way, and the more I thought about it, there were more and more songs that kind of fit that kind of criteria, right? Um, you can People can have different or conflicting opinions as to which of the song or which of the song's chords is the tonic. But yeah, that song called Rock With You by Michael Jackson, right, which I end the article with, that's a really tricky example, right? Because it begins with this chord, which is a E flat minor ninth chord, right? Then we get this chord. Yeah, that's a sol dominant, right? And then just kind of moving these sol dominant chords around. And then now that sounds like the 5 chord, but then back to that, right? It never ever seems to find that root position D flat chord that it's searching for all along, right? And I just started collecting songs like that, and it was just more and more examples. But then I realized, well, it's not always so much about the tonic chord being entirely absent. There's a kind of continuum. There's songs where the tonic chord is present, but it's weakened. It's like in first inversion in the middle of a phrase, or it's in extreme situations, it's in second inversion where it sounds very, very unstable. Like if you begin a song with this, with scale degree 5 in the bass, that's that Elton John's. The song is ostensibly an A flat major, but you never get a root position A flat chord in the song. The song begins with its tonic, but the chord is in second inversion. So there's different things present in the song, be it the notes that are in the bass, the notes that are in the melody, that affect, I think, the listener's perception of where the tonic might be. So for me, it was a hearing exercise more than anything else, and trying to describe the way in which I hear these songs. There is that song that I talk about in the article, which was well, it's about 10 years old now, called Get Lucky, right? Much as I wanted to say that that's a song or an example of a song with an absent tonic, right? Because the chords are that's the whole loop. It just keeps repeating that loop. Yeah, it all fits into the scale of A major, right? But I just can't hear it that way.
Yeah.
To me, it's kind of like a Dorian kind of shuttle, which is so common in funk, in late 1970s disco and funk, which is the style that Daft Punk were clearly referencing in that song. So
Especially with Nile Rodgers, right, on bass.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So to kind of force this and to say, okay, this is an absent tonic in A major, my ear did not support that. I had played that song a lot. I'd played lots of late 70s and 80s funk, and I've been, had to play certain songs way, way more than I wish I'd have ever had to, as in my cover band, the Bernadettes. And when you kind of live inside these chord loops and you play them and you experience them, I heard there was a paper at SMT following when I gave the absent tonics paper talking about Get Lucky as an example of an absent tonic song in A major, and I just couldn't buy it. But there you go. That was me. Right. So it's gotten a lot of mileage, that article. I'm quite proud of it, because I've kind of said my piece about tonality in pop and rock songs. One might question, well, does there really need to be kind of searching for a single tonic for a song? And I think that's not always the case either, you know. You can have different sections of a song can have different centers. Maybe we should use that word rather than tonic, right?
Yeah, that's actually something I have from my jazz undergrad. We always thought of key centers. We never really talked about what
Perhaps
key we
more.
were.
Uh, you probably saw that whole special issue or symposium recently in JMT, right? About questioning the whole idea of a tonic, whether we should use the term tonic because of the fact that it has possible kind of racist undertones and baggage, kind of going back to Fétis and others in the 19th century and the way they would talk about music that is tonal is perhaps more elite and superior to musics of other cultures and of other races that does not conform to more traditional notions of tonality. It, it's important to ask these questions. Yeah. So
Definitely. And I know you said mentioned that you've kind of said your piece on the harmony side of things, but that leads me to question that what do you have any plans for future research, or are you working on anything right now that you're particularly excited or interested about?
when I said I've said my piece, I probably will have something else to say about the soul dominant, because a lot of people have taken that term that I coined in that article. Um, well, I used to call it the rock dominant because me and my buddies at University of North Texas used to joke around about that chord. The soul dominant or the rock dominant is basically a close position 4 chord above scale degree 5 in the bass. So it could sound like this, or you could have a close position major 4/7 chord. That's another kind of variant on it. Or you could have a close position 2/7 over this kind of sound. The whole idea really about a soul dominant is that there is no leading tone in the chord, right? Even though it's a dominant chord, it has scale degree 1 in the upper voices rather than scale degree 7. So it kind of conflates subdominant and dominant functions,
Mm-hmm.
right? By later 1970s, you start to find the sonority used for its own sake. So sometimes that can be done in really strange ways. Like if you listen to Earth, Wind and Fire, for example, they'll have weird progressions, um, like like this. Um, Try to make functional sense of that by assigning Roman numerals. The song's really in this key. It's in A, although it begins with an A major 9. Both of those are soul dominants, but it's just moving them in parallel motion. So kind of a soul dominant with scale degree 4 in the bass, and then the proper soul dominant with scale degree 5 in the bass, right? And so what you're hearing there, this is the loop that infinitely repeats to end the song. It starts out on the 4 chord, 4 major 7, 3 minor 7, and then you get this, which is a soul dominant on sharp 4 in the bass, moving up by half step to the actual soul dominant with scale degree 5, right? And then kind of a reverse voice exchange. So the upper parts are going D major, E major, and the bass then goes E, D, and then it repeats the whole thing again. So it's kind of like you've got a soul dominant substituting for an applied sharp four something of five, resolving to another soul dominant. You tie your brain in knots trying to put uh, harmonic function on these kinds of chords with Roman numerals. But it's really how the sonority of the soul dominant is so important to the language of soul music and by its extension funk and disco and R&B, these other genres as we get into the later 1970s. So there's a lot more that I could say about that chord, and I may well do something on that soon. I saw that there was a poster, a nice poster by was at the SMT about the soul dominant. Forgive me, I've forgotten the name of the young scholar who did the paper, but anyway, I liked his paper, and he had tried to do a corpus study of predicting ways in which the soul dominant resolves. Is it preceded by or does it resolve to tonic? Does it resolve other ways? You know, this kind of thing. I don't have the patience for corpus studies myself, but I understand its value. Right? You're getting data that you can then make large scale observations about harmonic behavior and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have just a couple minutes left, getting towards the end at least. Um, uh, Kind of maybe last question or last couple questions. Um, Moving beyond your own personal research, has there been anything recently, music theory articles or books by other scholars that have been published recently that have you particularly excited or interested in just reading yourself, not necessarily something you're looking to publish about?
Um, I've just started reading it because I was sent a copy of it. Um, it's a new book by Tim Kuzin from the University of Houston. I think it's called Embodiment in Popular Music: A Theory of Gesture and Musical Agency. Right. Tim has published some work. We did a special issue of Music Theory Online about 13 years ago, all about form in popular music. I was the invited respondent for the SMT session, and then it was turned into a special issue of Music Theory Online. So it's a series of articles about form in popular music, but it has one of those cute titles, performing rock. So PER in parenthesis, form in rock, G. So performing rock, form in rock music, right? But one of the things that Tim has a piece in there where he's talking about shapes on the guitar fretboard, right? And how just the physical act of moving from one chord to another can affect the compositional process, like whether you write a song at the keyboard or at the guitar, this kind of thing. Just the sheer topography of the guitar fretboard versus like a keyboard, right? And it seems to me like he's really expanded on that work, and it's it's a really great book. I've just started reading it. In fact, we're inviting him to come to CUNY in the spring to give a talk about that, about his new book. So I find that quite exciting. I should say that there's another big study of mine that has yet to be published about the progressive rock group called Marillion, which were they're a group that aren't so widely known outside of the UK. I mean, I guess they do have something of a following in the US, but they were really big in the 1980s, and they sounded very much like Genesis, but like 10 years too late. Why were they writing music and putting out progressive rock albums in the 1980s when there was all this synth pop and other stuff on the charts. And so I was very interested about the reception of that band. And I also take a deep dive into their 1985 album called Misplaced Childhood and do an analysis of that. That is destined or slated for appearance in the Cambridge Handbook on Prog Rock, or Cambridge Companion to Prog Rock, that is forthcoming. So that's another thing I've got on the back burner. I'm the
So
chair of I'm the chair of the music department here right now. A lot of the work I do right now, Jacob, is being a chair, being an administrator,
uh,
which
that's
I,
actually one of the questions that I had slated, and we just never ended up getting around naturally to talking about that. But maybe that's a good place to end off. Is how has it been for you balancing all of the different various musical aspects of your life and career, the performing, your profession as a music theorist, and now, of course, like you mentioned, uh, kind of this more, I guess you could say, administrative role as the chair of the music department.
uh, um, I it's some honestly sometimes it's hard. I found myself stretched too thin. I mean, I wish I had more time to devote to my research and writing, which is I kind of do that in fits and starts. I have managed to do some things to interrupt my work as being a chair and stuff like that for it. I do teach at the CUNY Graduate Center every 3 or 4 semesters. And so that from there, I will get new doctoral students that will work with me as their um, dissertation advisor. So that has been a fairly constant stream now, and I'm very proud of the work that my dissertation advisees have gone on to do. Folks like Noriko Manabe and Drew Nobile and Megan Lavengood. They've all now very active members of the field themselves, and sort of the next generation of pop music scholars. Um, but yeah, it is tough to balance all of those different roles. Um, I don't really have an answer. I try to do the best I can, but I do, however, still feel lucky and blessed to have been able to make a career out of music, right? The kind of combination of being a musical thinker, a musical performer, um, writing books and articles and teaching, inspiring other generations. I mean, it's all fantastic. We've got to have things to smile about, and we have to enjoy what we do, I think. It's very important.
Well, yeah, Mark, that seems like a great place to put a nice bow on it and wrap up the interview. I just want to thank you again for taking the time to do this. It's been really great. And I will definitely let you know when the recording gets uploaded. And if you're interested, I can definitely send that your way.
Sure, I'll take a look. Although I I get a bit self-conscious when I watch myself back on camera, but I'm fine with that's good. It's been a pleasure, Jacob, to talk to you. Yeah.
Great. Well, have a great evening. Hope you get home safe and have a great rest of the semester and great time off during the upcoming break.
Yes, you too then, Jacob.
All
Okay.
right. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.